Number 8. The Akkadian Empire. The first great empire in recorded history did not fade into a clean ending. It cracked. That is why Akkad is the right place to open this countdown. When people imagine lost ancient empires, they usually picture a ruined city swallowed by jungle, or a kingdom erased so completely that no one remembers its name. Akkad is more unsettling than that. This was one of the earliest true empires in human history, built under Sargon of Akkad in Mesopotamia and stretched across a huge political landscape for its time. In other words, this was not a local kingdom that vanished quietly. It was one of the first large-scale attempts to prove that distant cities, different peoples, and wide territory could all be held inside one system of command. Then that system broke hard enough that later generations remembered the collapse almost as a warning. That is what makes the Akkadian Empire such a strong hook case. The mainstream explanation for its fall is not one dramatic mystery. It is a convergence of stress. Internal rebellion, external pressure, weakening control, and likely severe environmental instability all appear in the larger picture. That explanation is strong because early empires are fragile by nature. They depend on roads, grain, loyalty, messaging, military reach, and fear all working together across distances that were still hard to control. The deeper reason Akkad feels like it vanished is that the center stopped being able to project itself as inevitable. Once that happens, an empire can go from world-defining to ghostly with surprising speed. The fields remain, the rivers remain, the cities remain. But the thing that made them one empire no longer exists. That is the pattern this video is following. Ancient empires do not need to disappear without artifacts. They only need to lose the system that made them feel permanent. The Akkadian collapse matters for one more reason. It sets up the emotional logic of everything that follows. This was the first giant machine of power, and it still proved temporary. If even one of the earliest empires could rise so high and then splinter into memory, the viewer immediately understands the central fear behind this topic. Ancient power may have looked absolute while it lasted, but absolute is not the same as durable. And once the first great empire in history has already shown how fast a world-spanning order can begin to feel unreal in hindsight, the next case has to move to a kingdom far more visually familiar, because this time the ruins still look magnificent, even though the empire behind them slipped away. Number 7. The Nabatean Kingdom. The Nabatean Kingdom feels like the kind of power that should have lasted. That is what makes it such a good second case. Its wealth flowed through trade routes, desert knowledge, and one of the most visually unforgettable capitals in the ancient world. Petra still looks too dramatic to belong to a vanished kingdom. Facades cut into rose-colored rock, tombs, temples, channels, and hidden approaches all create the same impression. A state able to carve a city like this out of stone and make the desert work for it should not feel easy to lose. But that is exactly the point. Ancient empires do not always disappear because they are weak. Sometimes they disappear because the systems that made them valuable change faster than their image of power does. The mainstream explanation for the Nabatean decline is absorption rather than instant annihilation. Rome annexed the kingdom in the 2nd century AD, trade patterns shifted, and the political center that had once made Nabatean power distinct was folded into something larger. That explanation is correct. But the deeper reason the kingdom belongs near the start of the countdown is that it still gives viewers the feeling of a vanished world. Petra survived. The empire did not. The roads, the commercial logic, the independent political identity, and the wider sense of Nabatea as a power center all thinned out until the kingdom no longer existed as itself. This is where the countdown becomes more sophisticated. Some empires vanish in fire, others vanish by being absorbed, redirected, and emptied of their own central role until only the monumental shell keeps shouting that something larger used to be here. That tension is what makes Nabataea such a strong retention case. It is recognizable enough to pull broad viewers in, but the story underneath is darker than the postcard version. Petra is not just a beautiful ruin. It is evidence that even highly adapted desert power, backed by trade and engineering, can lose the historical conditions that made it matter. And once a kingdom this visually unforgettable can still end up feeling like something history mislaid. The next case has to move back into the Bronze Age, because now the question is no longer how an empire dies. It is how a superpower can break so badly that later civilizations inherit only the fragments. That is also why this revised order is better for retention than the earlier lineup. Akkad opens with the shock of the First Empire falling apart. Nabataea comes second because the image is instantly legible even to casual viewers. You do not need to explain Petra for long before people feel the loss. The case rewards them fast. They see the carved stone, the desert routes, the hidden channels, and they understand the larger promise of the video. Great powers can vanish, even when their ruins still look impossible. And once that promise is locked in, the next section can safely move into heavier Bronze Age collapse territory without losing momentum. Number 6. The Hittite Empire. The Hittite Empire should not have become ghostly this fast. At its height in the late Bronze Age, it was one of the great powers of the ancient Near East, strong enough to fight Egypt, bargain with Babylon, dominate much of Anatolia, and maintain a state system complex enough to archive treaties, commands, and royal correspondence at a scale that still impresses historians. Hattusa, its capital, was not a tribal hill town. It was a serious imperial center with monumental gates, storage systems, temples, fortifications, and the written machinery of rule. That matters because viewers need to feel the size of what disappeared. The Hittites were not marginal. They were one of the states helping define the political order of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East in the 13th century BC. Then, around the crisis horizon of about 1200 BC, that central order broke. Hattusa was abandoned. The imperial core collapsed. And a power that had once negotiated with the biggest kingdoms on earth stopped existing as an empire. The mainstream explanation is not one perfect mystery invasion. It is a convergence of pressures now associated with the wider Bronze Age collapse. Warfare, trade disruption, internal instability, environmental stress, and the fragility of palace-centered systems tied to long-distance exchange and military control. That explanation is strong. But the deeper reason the Hittite Empire feels as though it vanished is that the center failed so completely. Later Neo-Hittite states survived in parts of Syria and southeastern Anatolia, and Hittite cultural traditions did not blink out in a single instant. That is important. Yet the imperial structure itself was gone badly enough that later ages inherited fragments rather than continuity. This is the pattern that makes ancient collapse feel unreal. Not total erasure, but total loss of command. Once the palace world stops transmitting authority outward, the cities that remain are no longer one empire. They are survivors scattered in the wreckage of a system that can no longer call itself whole. That is why the Hittites belong exactly here in the countdown. Akkad showed the First Empire proving temporary. Nabataea showed how even a rich and visually unforgettable kingdom could lose the conditions that made it distinct. The Hittite Empire now adds a harsher lesson. A superpower can leave behind archives, eels, carved stones, and successor states, and still feel like it disappeared because the central organism of empire died faster than the material world around it. Even now, the surviving tablets and ruins make the loss feel sharper, not softer, because they prove how much bureaucracy, memory, and control once stood behind the empire before it failed. And once one Bronze Age giant has collapsed that hard, the next case has to move to another kingdom of fortresses and reservoirs in the mountains, because this time the sense of loss comes not only from a broken center, but from how completely a former rival can slip behind the more famous stories that followed. Number 5. Urartu. Urartu is one of the best cases in this video because it feels like the kind of empire history should talk about more than it does. Centered around the Armenian highlands and flourishing in the early 1st millennium BC, Urartu built fortresses, administrative centers, irrigation works, inscriptions, and a recognizable royal culture, powerful enough to challenge Assyria at times. This was not a footnote state. It was a mountain empire that understood stone, altitude, and water control well enough to turn harsh landscapes into defended political space. That matters because it gives the viewer a very specific kind of vanished feeling. Urartu did not leave behind one glamorous capital like Petra. It left behind a pattern of hard infrastructure, scattered strongholds, and inscriptions that suggest a serious kingdom once stood here with confidence. And yet, for many modern viewers, it barely exists in the popular imagination. The mainstream explanation for Urartu's disappearance is again structural rather than magical. It faced military pressure, shifting regional power, and the long instability that comes when neighboring empires rise, fall, and absorb borderlands. By the late 7th and early 6th centuries BC, the kingdom had fragmented and been overtaken by new political formations. That explanation is persuasive. But the deeper reason Urartu belongs in the middle of this countdown is that it shows how an empire can vanish, not because nothing survives, but because later history grows over it so completely that only specialists still feel its former weight. The stones remain. The fortresses remain. The inscriptions remain. The imperial self does not. It is one of the most haunting kinds of disappearance because it is partly a loss of memory. A state can once be central to the balance of power and later end up living at the edge of historical awareness. That is the retention move this video needs halfway through. The Hittites are a recognized Bronze Age superpower. Urartu feels like the empire that should be famous and somehow is not. That contrast keeps the countdown evolving. We are no longer only watching power fall. We are watching visibility fall with it. Some empires collapse so thoroughly that their names retreat behind the civilizations that came before and after them. Urartu makes that loss feel physical. You can still see the fortresses on the heights and the carved messages on stone. Yet the kingdom that ordered them has become strangely thin in public memory. And once a mountain kingdom with this much stone labor and royal ambition can still end up half hidden in the public imagination, the next section has to move south. Because one of the biggest powers ever built in Africa would later suffer a similar fate. Number 4. The Kingdom of Aksum. Aksum is one of the best cases in this video because it feels like an empire modern audiences should know far better than they do. At its height, the Kingdom of Aksum in the Horn of Africa was not a regional curiosity. It was a serious power connected to the Red Sea, the Nile world, Arabia, and the wider trade systems linking the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. It minted its own coins. It projected royal ideology in stone through massive stelae. It built authority on trade, agriculture, and strategic position. In late antiquity, this was a kingdom important enough to matter in the same conversations as other major states of its time. That is what gives the collapse its force. When an empire this connected fades out of broad historical memory, the loss feels larger than the ruins alone. The mainstream explanation for Aksum's decline is not one sudden apocalypse. It is the gradual weakening of the structures that made the kingdom powerful in the first place. Trade routes shifted. The political world of the Red Sea changed. Environmental stress may have added pressure. The center of gravity moved. That explanation is strong because empires built on exchange do not only depend on armies and kings, they depend on the continued usefulness of their location. Once the flows of commerce and influence begin to bend elsewhere, even a sophisticated kingdom can start shrinking from the edges inward. But the deeper reason Aksum belongs this high in the countdown is that the visual and historical residue still suggests something much larger than the place it occupies in popular memory. The monuments remain. The inscriptions remain. The coinage remains. Yet the empire itself has become strangely faint in the way broad audiences imagine the ancient world. That faintness matters because it reveals another form of disappearance. Some empires vanish through fire. Others vanish through silence. Aksum did not need to be obliterated overnight to produce the same unsettling effect. It only needed to stop functioning as one of the great connected powers of its age and then recede behind later political and religious histories that overshadowed it. Once that happened, the kingdom became the kind of empire people rediscover rather than the kind they inherit vividly. That is why Aksum works so well in the middle of this countdown. It widens the map. It proves that ancient imperial disappearance is not only a story about Mesopotamia, Anatolia, or the Mediterranean. It is also a story about Africa, about trade routes going quiet, and about states large enough to mint money and shape regions later becoming half-remembered outside specialist circles. And once a power this connected can dim so far in public memory, the next case has to move to one of the most famous ruined worlds on Earth, because now the scale of disappearance becomes even harder to ignore. Number 3. Cahokia. Cahokia is one of the strongest retention cases in the entire lineup because it attacks the viewer's assumptions immediately. Many people still imagine pre-Columbian North America, north of Mexico, as a world without true urban power on a monumental scale. Cahokia destroys that assumption. Near present-day St. Louis, this Mississippian center rose into one of the largest urban complexes in North America before European contact. Monk's Mound still dominates the site, but it matters because it hints at something far larger than one platform. Cahokia had plazas, neighborhoods, timber circles, craft production, elite compounds, long-distance exchange, and a political gravity strong enough to draw in people, labor, and belief from across a huge region. This was not an oversized village. It was a center, and that is what makes its decline feel so strange. A place this large and this organized should not feel as though it slipped partly out of public memory. The mainstream explanation is not that Cahokia simply vanished overnight in one dramatic disaster. The stronger reading points to mounting pressures that made the city harder to sustain. Environmental instability may have played a role. Flooding, overuse of local resources, political stress, factional conflict, and the difficulty of holding such a large center together may all have contributed. That explanation is persuasive because Cahokia was not magic. It was a massive social system, and massive social systems become fragile when multiple pressures start landing at once. But the deeper reason Cahokia belongs at number 3 is emotional and civilizational. It is not just that the city declined. It is that the modern world spent so long underestimating what had been there that the site carries 2 disappearances at once. First, the original political world collapsed. Then, much later, the scale of that world faded from ordinary historical imagination. That double loss gives Cahokia its power in this countdown. Akkad showed the first empire, proving temporary. Nabatea showed a kingdom whose monumental shell outlived its political identity. The Hittites showed a superpower, losing its center. Urartu revealed how an empire can survive in stone while fading in public consciousness. Aksum did the same on an African scale. Cahokia now pushes the pattern into a part of the world many viewers were never taught to read this way. It is a vanished center, hidden not in jungle or desert, but in plain sight inside a broader historical blind spot. And once the viewer understands that even North America held an ancient power large enough to feel unreal in hindsight, the final section can move to the two most haunting endings of all. One where the ruins remain, but the people seem to step away, and one where an entire urban world loses the system that once made it breathe. Number 2, the Greenland Norse. The Greenland Norse are the most unsettling case in the countdown because they did not vanish into myth. They vanished into weather, silence, and a landscape that kept their buildings after it lost their voices. By the time Norse settlers established their colonies in Greenland around the late 10th century, they had already proven something extraordinary. They could push farming, animal husbandry, church life, law, and trade into an environment that looked too marginal to sustain a European colony for centuries. Yet for a time they did exactly that. They built churches, they raised livestock, they traded walrus ivory and other goods. They maintained links, however fragile, to Iceland, Norway, and the wider North Atlantic world. This was not a temporary raiding station. It was a frontier society trying to make itself durable at the edge of habitability. That is what makes the ending hit so hard. When later Europeans came back, they found ruins, not a functioning colony. The farms were there. The churches were there. The people were not. The mainstream explanation is not one dramatic disappearance in a single season. It is a long tightening of pressures. Climate cooled during the Little Ice Age. Sea ice made communication and trade harder. The value of walrus ivory changed as global markets shifted. Isolation deepened. Resources narrowed. The Norse way of life in Greenland became harder to sustain. That explanation is strong because the archaeological and historical picture points to attrition rather than cinematic annihilation. But the deeper reason the Greenland Norse belong this high in the countdown is emotional and structural at the same time. They built a recognizable world at the far edge of survivability and then failed to keep enough connection, flexibility, and support to hold it together. This is ancient empire collapse in miniature, and that is why it works so well here. It shows the same pattern on a smaller but more intimate scale. A political and cultural extension of a larger world settled a frontier, created institutions, then thinned out until later arrivals stood among the remains asking the same question viewers ask now. How can a place be this real and still lose its people so completely? That question is what gives the Greenland Norse their power in a retention-driven lineup. By this point, the viewer has already seen empires lose capitals, trade systems, dynastic order, and political geography. Greenland adds one more layer. It shows what happens when the buildings remain, but the community itself seems to step off the stage. There is no need for a lost city fantasy. The ruins are enough. They tell you this colony existed. They tell you it was organized. They tell you it had faith, labor, livestock, and memory. Then they tell you nothing more. That silence is what makes the case feel like a disappearance rather than a decline. And once a colony world this tangible can still end in such emptiness, the final case has to be the one that best combines scale, fame, ruined cities, and the feeling that an entire ancient world once pulsed here before dropping out of its own system. Number 1. The classic Maya world. The Maya are the right final case because they deliver the strongest possible version of the title's promise. This is not one lost city and not one royal line. It is an entire ancient world that once felt alive with courts, inscriptions, alliances, wars, ritual, engineering, and urban ambition, then lost the system that made all of that cohere. By the height of the classic period, the southern Maya lowlands were dense with powerful cities like Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, Copan, and dozens of other centers tied together through rivalry, marriage politics, monument building, tribute, and shifting balances of fear and prestige. These were not isolated monuments in a jungle. They were parts of a living political map. Reservoirs captured water. Causeways linked architecture. Glyphs recorded rulers and wars. Stelae announced victories. Dynasties projected permanence. That is exactly why the collapse remains so haunting. The more monumental the world appears, the harder it is to absorb that so much of its political life could thin, break, and be abandoned. The mainstream explanation is not that the Maya people vanished. They did not. That point must stay clear. Maya communities survived, adapted, and continued, and later, northern centers flourished in different ways. The stronger explanation is that the classic southern lowland order collapsed under converging stress. Repeated drought appears to have strained water systems and agriculture. Warfare intensified. Elite legitimacy weakened. Networks that had once supported the great dynastic capitals became harder to sustain. That explanation is strong because it matches the archaeology, the paleoclimate evidence, and the patterns of site, abandonment, and reduced monument erection. But the deeper reason the classic Maya world is the best final payoff is that it feels like the purest version of an ancient world vanishing in plain sight. The cities remain visible enough to prove how much existed, yet the integrated political order that once gave them meaning no longer holds. You are left with plazas without processions, palaces without courts, stelae without the living system that made them current events instead of remnants. That is the larger pattern this whole countdown has been building toward. Akkad showed that the first empire in history could still crack. Nabataea proved that even a kingdom rich in roots, engineering, and visual power could be absorbed until only the monumental shell kept its memory loud. The Hittites showed how a Bronze Age superpower could lose its center so completely that successor states felt like fragments of a broken machine. Urartu revealed how a serious mountain empire could survive in stone while fading in public memory. Aksum demonstrated that coinage, monuments, and international trade still do not guarantee lasting visibility in the historical imagination. Greenland showed what happens when the buildings remain, but the people seem to drain away. The classic Maya world takes all of those lessons and enlarges them. It gives you scale, fame, ruins, literacy, beauty, and density, then removes the system that once made them one of the great living worlds of antiquity. And that may be the real reason vanished empires hold attention so hard. The ruins are not only evidence of past greatness, they are evidence that greatness can stop functioning long before the material world around it is gone. Empires rarely disappear without a trace. What disappears first is their ability to keep turning roads, fields, cities, rituals, archives, and subjects into one recognizable order. Once that goes, the stones can remain for thousands of years and still leave behind the same eerie impression. A whole world was here. Then, somehow, it wasn't.